Good afternoon, friends, and welcome to the executive session at 3:45 of the Hancock Symposium. I have the pleasure today of introducing our next speaker, Dr. Mannie Liscum. After graduating from SUNY Plattsburgh, Mannie matriculated to the Ohio State to complete his PhD. Following graduate school, Mannie completed postdoctoral work at the Carnegie Institution of Washington at Stanford University. Mannie then joined as a faculty member at the University of Missouri in 1996 and opened his lab where he continued to pursue questions related to light-regulated plant growth and development. As a faculty scholar in the Middleton Center for Race, Citizenship, and Justice, he's expanded his focus to the history of eugenics, persistence of prejudice, particularly anti-Semitism. In addition to research, Mannie continues to teach a wide variety of classes to biology majors and non-majors as well. He has mentored many postdocs, graduate students, myself included, and undergraduates. Mannie also has many interests outside of science. He's a published military historian. He loves attending heavy metal concerts. And you will never find him without a book in his hand, and his pumpkin carving abilities are legendary. I kid you not. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mannie Liscum to the Hancock Symposium at Westminster College.
Can everyone hear me okay? I think I could project in this room anyways. This is an amazing venue. I've never given a talk in something quite as nice as this. So I feel honored to be here, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, thank Joe for suggesting me, and hopefully give you a worthwhile look at some history that crosses Britain, the United States, Germany, the world writ large. So today we'll talk about the unwieldy melding of science, prejudice, and law that is the legacy of eugenics. And if I make sure I do the things right. We have a couple quotes here. I don't want you to read all these, okay? These quotes, I'm going to highlight the pieces that are particularly important. So the first one, the feeble-minded and insane classes constitutes a national and race danger. The source should be cut off and sealed up before another year has passed. This was quoted in 1910. The second quote, it should be made impossible for defective people to propagate defective offspring with the result that there will be a gradual improvement of national health, and that was stated in 1924. If you want to know who said these things, I'll get to that in a second. These are common ideas that were floating around during the late 19th, early 20th century in the eugenics movement. These quotes come from Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler. So one of the things you ought to automatically be asking yourself on a campus that honors, rightfully so, Winston Churchill is, how did Winston Churchill say such a, what we could say now is a profoundly ugly thing? I want to point out that with the benefit of history, right, hindsight, we now understand that only one of these men took this to a genocidal level, right? And that was Hitler. Churchill, on the other hand, and Hitler were both men of their times. And their times were prejudiced. Their times had racism, sexism, ableism, all the kinds of things that were floating at the period. They were also part of the upper class, gentrified white. So they had certain things that they had in common that were operating within the strata where they were living. So that they had similar views on these things should not be too surprising, okay? And I think here the lesson that I want to point out from just these two quotes is that history is rarely black and white. It's nuanced and gray, and the decisions that we make along the tree of life have consequences. So the decisions Hitler made about these ideas were different than the decisions that Churchill made, right? So today we're going to talk about the origins and genesis of eugenic thought. Sorry, I walk around. I'm a teacher. I like to do this, right? I don't like to stand on stages. The eugenics movement, and it's preached justice for all, and I'm going to couch all of this in ideas of justice because that's the theme of the symposium. In the late 19th and 20th, early 20th centuries, largely in the United States, look at race, immigration, and citizenship laws in the United States during this period, and I'm titling this Justice for Some, Injustice for Some, and then look at Nazi Germany's applications of American law and eugenics for its Völkisch justice, which I would call injustice for a great many, which led ultimately to the Holocaust and Shoah. And then just some concluding reflections on kind of what we talked about. So origins and genesis of eugenic thought. So where did we start? So Francis Galton, this man on your right, introduced the term of eugenics in 1883, basing it on a Greek word that was eugenes, which meant noble or well-born. And he was initially motivated by the work of his half-cousin, Charles Darwin, and many people have used Darwin's works in a social context called social Darwinism inappropriately because that's not what Darwin was saying in his evolutionary context. So, yeah, so if we're going to take questions during, that's fine. I would rather we take questions at the end, but we can take questions during. If you guys want to do that, interrupt me. It's fine. So yes, Darwin was also a man of the times, right? So all of that racism and isms that were floating in society, Darwin wasn't immune to that. He was not a fighter for the equal rights of everyone. But his ideas on evolution didn't really reach into the social strata. That's not what he was talking about when he talked about evolution. Doesn't mean that he didn't feel similarly. It just means that that was not what he was educating, right? So Galton was a statistics person. He was a polymath, actually. He had lots of interests, but he started applying statistics to human pedigrees and interpreting it through the lens of survival of the fittest, and therefore there are good and bad human beings. This is where it's really started. And then in 1900, Mendel's law of genetics were rediscovered. So Mendel did his work many decades before, but they weren't really rediscovered and made part of the scientific community until 1900. And then Galton and people that were thinking like him became convinced that there were genetic, definable hereditary units that gave rise to good and bad traits in society, defined not necessarily by genetics, but by social context, okay? So in the early 1900s, eugenics was at the cutting edge of science. It wasn't the cutting edge, but it was one of the cutting edges. So this is a science that isn't just hokum that we see it now. At the time, it was considered real, valuable science. And a good example of that is this definition of eugenics. And there are lots of definitions, but I pulled this one because it works pretty well. Eugenics is a science of improvement of the human race by better breeding. This was made by Charles Davenport. I was a postdoc at the Carnegie Institution in Washington. He was director of, at the time, it was the Department of Experimental Evolution. It's now embryology at Cold Spring Harbor. This is not a minor scientific institution. This guy was a leading eugenicist. He was taken very seriously. Human pedigrees were, actually, I don't know how we got, let me go back for a second. There should have been some more things. Okay, that's okay. Human pedigrees became kind of the go-to evidence, scientific evidence for eugenic thoughts. And I want to point out that these pedigrees were based largely upon interviews. So you go out and you interview people in communities. You pick the communities you want to interview, right? So you go to rural, backwoods places and interview people. And people are sometimes honest and sometimes less honest. Sometimes they don't like each other, so they say things about each other. So these pedigrees aren't necessarily based on real data. It's based on interviews. And hearsay, a lot of hearsay went into these things. This was a big thing. There was at the Cold Spring Harbor, there was a group that was called the Eugenics Record Office, And they sent out many people to do these interviews and collect lots and lots of pedigree data. And there were a lot of studies that were produced about different pedigrees in different regions of the United States and different communities that started looking at poverty. The term feeble-mindedness was a big thing in the late 1900s, early 20th century, which just could be labeled. It's kind of like if you have a child that doesn't sleep well, we call it colic because we don't know any better. Feeble-mindedness was the way of describing people that didn't fit your norm in a kind of educational or mental way, right? It was a catch-all. There was no meaning to it. At the same time, we invented the terms moron, things like that. That gradation of mental illness that we now don't use, right, was generated during this time. So a lot of these studies generated. Some, like the Army mental tests, were IQ tests that were given to American soldiers during the First World War. Lots of soldiers. Most of them were rated as morons. Were they really morons, or was the test biased? Well, we know that IQ tests don't really test those things. But at the time, this was cutting-edge science. Remember that. We now know that these studies are flawed and they're misinterpreted. So this is what we know now. But in the progressive era, which I'm labeling the 1890s to 1920s, these works and others were held up with great esteem by the intellectuals of the progressive period, because this was the cutting-edge science. And it wasn't just in the United States, it was in Western Europe as well. So there were eugenicists in Europe as well. It started in England with Galton and moved to the United States. If you don't know, progressivism was largely a movement of privileged white upper middle class, and it aimed at finding solutions to growing problems associated with industrialization, urbanization, immigration, and political corruption. I would like to point out that there are some recurring themes in this that we're seeing now. Be aware, okay? History has a tendency to repeat itself if we are not aware of it. They thought they were doing good work. This is justice for all in their minds. They're trying to make society better. And they thought this was a scientific way of doing it. To the progressives, the eugenic pedigrees and IQ studies appeared to provide clear genetic evidence that there were familiar sources, right? Hereditary sources of socially unfit. That could range from physical unfitness. Epilepsy was considered an unfitness that had to be put into an asylum, essentially. Again, feeble-mindedness, a variety of other things. Criminality, pauperism, poorness, alcoholism, prostitution. These were all considered genetic because you had pedigrees of people who now we know it's environmentally based, it's society based. Like there are families that might fall into pauperism because they've never had an opportunity to get out of it. Doesn't mean it's genetic, but at the time it was considered genetic. And the progressives thought, great, we have an explanation for things, right? And they lopped on to eugenics and said, if eugenics is a science to improve human race by better breeding, then it follows that these unfit traits could be bred out. We can fix society. We can just breed good traits, keep those who have bad traits from breeding. Sweet and simple. So this is all based on what we do in crops and animals. We've been breeding crops and animals for 10,000 years. This is not, the base of the genetics of this is not wrong. It's the interpretation of the collections of data that the eugenicists got that wasn't genetic that was wrong. So the basis for the selective breeding we already had. So you can force breeding of individuals with good traits. So you see on the, I have a plant example and an animal example. So you can't really see the Dalmatians, but the more spotted they are, the more we like them. So we breed the spotted ones to each other, okay? And the plants, these are tomato plants, I think. The ones that make lots of fruit, we breed those together, right? This is how we get the fruits and vegetables and dog breeds that we currently like. And if there are ones that don't do well, no spots, no tomatoes, we don't breed them. Their genetics are gone. This is real genetics. As a plant geneticist, this is real genetics. There's never been anything that said this isn't real genetics. it follows from that you can apply it to humans. And in reality, we are genetic. You could apply this to humans if, in fact, all of these traits were genetic based, okay? So to a eugenicist, you encourage the breeding of individuals with desired traits. In the early 1900s, 1920s and 30s, the American Eugenics Society sponsored what were called fitter family contests around the country, usually at county fairs. So they would get people together who would bring their children. It's kind of like the baby contest we have now, but a much kind of different approach to it, which was, who has the best genes? And you notice there's not a person of color in that picture. This is usually a commonality. This was common to have these kind of competitions. They gave away medals. I really want one of these for my personal collection, not because I agree with it, but it's a piece of history. That these medals were given out for a fitter family, right? They gave these and I have met another scholar of eugenics who actually has one of these and carries it around, and I was so envious. That's positive. That's what we call positive genetics. So if you think about it, it's not negative. You're saying there are good traits. Let's breed those good traits, right? It's easy to fall. I want you all to put yourself in the early 1920s. It's easy to fall into these kinds of thoughts when they're not inherently bad. Eugenics is not inherently bad. What it was bad science, but the ideas are not inherently bad. And I would argue that much of modern medicine is essentially eugenics, because we're trying to prevent bad things from happening, right, by medicines and treatments. That's a whole other side. The flip side to this is to discourage breeding of those who we feel are unfit, right? So those plants that don't make tomatoes, the dogs that don't have spots. In this case, you see this photo here. You can't read the signs, but this is from the Medical Review of Reviews, and they sponsored a pro-eugenics demonstration where they hired vagrants to hold signs that said, you know, I'm feeble-minded, I should never have kids. I'm an alcoholic, I should never have kids, right? So they're promoting what they were considering genetic traits, which were based on pedigrees of families in bad social circumstances largely, or hearsay and misinterpretation of things, right? Counting that as genetics and saying, okay, let's let the public know we can breed good genetics and we can breed away the bad genetics. And again, the progressives didn't see this as a bad thing. They saw this as, this is justice for all. We're going to make society better, right? So that's called negative eugenics. So you have positive eugenics and negative eugenics. And the valence is really if you're promoting breeding or preventing it. Unfortunately, with the progressives, as we've already seen with the quote from Churchill and Hitler, that comparison, they came to all of this ideology with all of the biases that they had in their upper middle class white society, which was racism, classism, ableism, all the prejudice that were common then. They weren't any less prejudiced in society than we are currently. In fact, I would say there are a lot of parallels. Again, I think the 1920s have a lot of parallels, the 1920s, 30s have a lot of parallels to now. Both the science of eugenics and the practice of eugenics, so not just the practice like positive and negative eugenic breeding, but also the scientists that were studying it were all colored by these biases. And this is true of all science all the time. Scientists are not, we like to think we're free of bias and we're doing things that have no bias associated with it, but we all have bias that we bring to the table. We have bias in who is funding the research, right? Whether that's the federal government or a private industry. There are always biases. These people reflected their times. And again, I'm not saying it was okay, I'm just saying you understand it in the context of when it was. In hindsight, it makes sense if you look at it now and say, there's no way eugenics could have happened without the progressives, right? Because they made it societal. because they were looking to do good things, and they glommed onto a bad science that said we can do good things just by breeding differently. So I don't think it would have had the impact it had in history had it not been for the progressive movement, which wasn't inherently bad, right? Again, it's the path you take along that tree of life. So let's talk about some people in the progressive movement who were evangelists for eugenics, right? And I say evangelists not to disrespect the fact that we're in a church, but as a base word, not a religious word. Teddy Roosevelt, President of the United States, eugenicist. He did all these good things. He was a passionate environmentalist. He was an antitrust monopoly crusader, advocated for consumer rights when he was president. He was also a trained biologist and a social Darwinist, misinterpreting Darwin's ideas, right? And he embraced the eugenics movement. In a letter to Charles Davenport, that director of the Carnegie Institution in Cold Spring Harbor, this is what our former president said: "Society has no business to permit degenerates to reproduce their own kind." We hold Teddy Roosevelt, I mean, of course it's political, so there are people don't like him, people like him, but he's generally considered one of the better presidents. He had faults, he had flaws. Margaret Sanger, some of you probably know who Margaret Sanger is. She founded Planned Parenthood. Crusader for women's rights and birth control. She was also a dyed-in-the-wool eugenicist. She once lectured at Vassar College about the importance of reducing the rapid multiplication of the unfit and the undesirable. So even though she was pro-woman and trying to give women the right to choose what they do with their bodily autonomy, in the case of birth control, she also saw birth control as a way of preventing undesirables. Okay? Came with both things. Madison Grant, probably most of you are not aware of him, but you would be aware of some of the things he did. He is a lawyer and a naturalist who co-founded Save the Redwoods, that helped make the redwoods in California a national monument. He also helped create Glacier and Denali National Parks. But he was also critical in shaping the idea of the Nordic Aryan race. He published a book called The Passing of the Great Race, where he labeled different races of humanity and put the Aryans, the Nordics, at the top. He brought that to the United States. One of his fans called it his Bible. His fan, Adolf Hitler. The connections are ugly. They're really ugly. A lesser known, but I think more impactful prophet was Harry Laughlin. And Harry Laughlin's a Missourian. He was a graduate of the first normal school, which is now Truman State. He had a PhD from Princeton, a very educated man. He was the director of the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor, so he worked with Davenport. This is him with Davenport. Laughlin was the leading evangelist for eugenics in the halls of power. So I'm going to give you a little bit of Laughlin's background and what he did to contribute to eugenics. 1922 and 1924, Laughlin testified to Congress. We were going through, I'm going to say it again, similar things to we're doing now, where we were generating immigration laws that were very restrictive. We didn't want the foreigners in our country. Again, during the progressive era where we were supposedly trying to. His testimony provided scientific support for the Immigration Act of 1924. This is one of the most broad-reaching and restrictive, racialized and prejudiced pieces of legislation that's impacted U.S. Immigration in our history. It's not the only piece, but it is a really important piece of legislation. And that's a segue to American race and immigration citizenship laws, because I think it's important that we understand how our country developed these things. And then I'll show you how we had impact on Nazi Germany. We want to think that we just fought Nazi Germany, but we provided a lot of the intellectual bedrock for the way the Nazis operated. Not intentionally necessarily. So here's a quote from a scholar who's talking about immigration. She says, the immigration laws are the gates that allow some immigrants into the country, shutting it out to others. They're based on complex intersection of economic interests, foreign policies, racial and ethnic biases, and other factors. They help define what it means to be American. Does this sound familiar? I'm going to say yes, it does. Not just historically, present day. And reflect and reinforce racial, ethnic, class, and gender relations. This is what was said about our U.S. immigration laws. As can probably be divined from that, no pun intended, defined from that quote, the Immigration Act of 1924 was only one in a long line of problematic U.S. immigration laws and policies. So let's go back in time. 1790 Naturalization Act, one of the first ones we passed. Any alien being a free white person with 2 years residence can become a naturalized citizen. Very racialized, right out of the gate. 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act eliminated Chinese immigration completely. This started mostly on the West Coast. In a debate over the act, California Senator John Miller stated that the Chinese represent a degraded and inferior race and a threat to national security. Again, sound familiar? 1921 Emergency Quota Act, which preceded the 1924 Act. It's also known as the 3% Act because it limited immigration from any country in the world to 3% of the number from that country that resided in the U.S. at the time of the 1910 census. This was not a random choice, as we'll come back to. The Immigration Act of 1924, again, very big one, I didn't tell you what it is. It halted immigration of all aliens not eligible for naturalization or citizenship by existing laws, which meant essentially non-whites. It also reduced the quota from eligible immigrants from the 1921 3% Act, now not based on the 1910, but based on the 1890 census, so a different census going back 20 years, and it set it at 2%. There was no randomness to this choice. The change in census year appeared to be deliberate, and it dramatically reduced the numbers of Southern and Eastern Europeans in favor of Nordic peoples. So in 1890, there were more people coming from Western Europe than there were from Eastern Europe. That increase in immigration from Eastern Europe was occurring coincidental with the uprisings of the revolution in the former Russia. Also, pogroms against Jews in Russia, so there was a lot of immigration of Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans, meaning the Baltics and Italy. There were very few of them in 1810. So if you take 2% of nothing, it's nothing. If you take 2% of a lot, it's a lot. So this change, 1910 to 1890, was meaningful and it had impact. Southern and Eastern Europeans comprised 2/3 of the immigrants in 1920 and 21. In 1924-25, they were 1/10. You see how dramatic that decrease was? Jewish immigrants fell from 190,000 to 7,000 between 1920 and 1926. This last one is not inconsequential because in 15 years, we have persecution of Jews in Nazi Germany, and there's no place for them to go. It has a direct impact on the numbers of the Holocaust. Yeah. Yeah, the Irish were unique. They were not reduced so much. There was still prejudice against them coming into the country, and still prejudice when they got here, but they weren't targeted by this particular legislation. Great question. Okay, so the system, immigration, until present, was only righted in 1965. So that 1924 Act played until 1965, when we had the passage of the Immigration and Naturalization Act, which got us back to a place where we were being more reasonable about our immigration. And I'm not saying we have a perfect immigration system. We do not. It needs to be fixed. I don't think going back to this is the way to fix it. Some race laws. So we've looked at immigration. Let's look at how did the United States view race legally. So there are a variety of what are known as anti-miscegenation laws. These are laws permitting marriage between non-whites and sexual relations between non-whites and whites. There have been a lot of these. These are some of the oldest laws in the United States and the most persistent laws in the United States. They arose in 1662 in colonial Virginia. Wasn't actually reversed as an idea legally until 1967 with Loving versus Virginia, where this couple, the Lovings, got married in Washington, D.C., went back to Virginia, were arrested, had to go to court, ended up in the Supreme Court. Supreme Court ruled, you can marry whoever you want. Now, of course, we all know that actually wasn't, you can marry whoever you want. It was just, there's no racial divide between marriage, because a man couldn't marry a man and a woman couldn't marry a woman. That only changed in the last decade, right? Jim Crow laws, everyone's familiar with Jim Crow laws? These are a variety, a whole constellation of laws and statutes in post-Reconstruction America that generated racialized spaces or racial spaces in public areas, schools, parks, accommodations, transportations, that either whites or African Americans could use, but never the two twain shall meet, okay? Other Jim Crow laws sought to prevent African American males who now had the right to vote. When these acts were coming up, it also corresponded to the time of universal suffrage, but they were preventing African American males from voting. These are really common laws in the South after Reconstruction, right? So the South lost the war. Suddenly, African Americans had rights. 15th, 16th, 17th Amendment, 14th, 15th, 16th Amendments gave broader rights to Americans across the spectrum. The South fought back, right? They got a workaround. They came up with these local laws, Jim Crow laws. These laws and statutes didn't arise in a vacuum, excuse me. Indeed, prejudice was the glue holding the progressives together. So any of these things that happened during the progressive era happened because these people were inherently prejudiced. It was part of our society, right? And I'm not branding them all as bigots, but it was a common thought process. So it didn't even enter their mind that they were doing something that we now see as morally corrupt, right? At the time, it was not considered that way. It shouldn't surprise us that progressivism, societal prejudice, and eugenic science collided to generate prejudicial eugenic law. So now we'll look at eugenic law. Again, back to this. If eugenics is the science of improvement of human race by better breeding, then it follows those traits of unfit can be bred out, the traits of good can be bred in. So from eugenic law standpoint, it was negative eugenics that was targeted. It's hard to target positive eugenics. You can't. Progressives were not going to force people to breed, right? We now have, I don't know what it's, $2,000 or something you can get for making more babies now. That's a positive, could be seen as a positive eugenic thing. This is negative eugenics, and the negative eugenics was compulsory, state-sponsored sterilization. Okay? So in 1907, the first eugenic sterilization law was passed in Indiana. The preamble read, heredity plays the most important part in the transmission of crime, idiocy, and imbecility. So they've linked three things that have no, currently, genetic linkage understanding, right? At the time, they were based on these pedigrees and hearsay that linked these things to genetics, which linked it to eugenics, which said we could breed it out. No actual evidence that these things are genetically determined. There may be genetics that's determining certain traits that play into things, but we don't even know that, right? But they believed it, so they passed a law that said this is what happens. Between 1907 and 1918, 14 additional states passed eugenic laws. Missouri is not in that group at that point in time. Between 1911 and 1922, 8 of those laws were found to be unconstitutional. So it's like today. Anytime a law comes up or anytime an executive order comes up, it ends up in the Supreme Court, right? I mean, same thing. If you cross a line, it's going to go through the courts. Most of those were found unconstitutional based on violations of components of the 14th Amendment. There were some that have violated state laws as well. This is when Harry Laughlin comes in. There was a reason I introduced Harry Laughlin. It wasn't just because he had important testimony for the Immigration Act. He was also the leader in eugenic sterilization work. So as the director of the Eugenics Record Office and a mover and shaker within the eugenics community, Laughlin took upon himself the task of examining all the eugenic legislation that was out there, sterilization. Am I okay on time? Okay. Just checking my time because I tend to just talk. He looked at all the laws that were out there and all the court cases and put all that information down and then tried to come up with a model eugenic law, sterilization law, that could pass the muster of the courts. Okay? And in 1922, he published this treatise through what was then the Chicago Library System, I believe. And it included his model law. Now we move into the sterilization of Carrie Buck. You may have heard of Carrie Buck before, or Buck versus Bell. It's a very famous Supreme Court case. I won't say it's the most important Supreme Court case, but it has importance. They're mostly important, right? In Virginia, remember them from Loving versus Virginia? They've had issues at times. They were the first state to test the legal hardiness of Laughlin's eugenic sterilization model. So they passed their Eugenic Sterilization Act in 1924, and it was based largely on Laughlin's model and partially on a California law. And Laughlin got together with this guy, Aubrey Strode, who was a senator in Virginia who actually got that legislation passed. So Laughlin's buddying up with a senator to pass a law that they then felt, this is a good law. Let's get in touch with all the health and criminal institutions in the state, because at that time we would just lock people away for a variety of things. Let them find someone they think is an ideal candidate for sterilization, and we'll test this law. So the Virginia Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded, you gotta love the names of these places, in Lynchburg, identified 17-year-old at that time, Carrie Buck, as their priority for sterilization. So all these entities came up with their best case, and it turned out that Carrie was the choice, the support for her sterilization. So I'm giving you what they thought was the reasons why she should be sterilized. Were considered plentiful. Before commitment, she was found to be feeble-minded by 2 physicians and a judge. Whatever feeble-minded was, they said she was. The colony doctors confirmed her feeble-mindedness and what she was committed. No big surprise there. Her mother was also feeble-minded and a patient at the colony. 8 additional members of her presumed family were patients of the colony. Again, presumed, never really proven, just similar name or maybe possibly similar lineage. As a defective, this is the terminology used, as a defective 17-year-old, she had a child out of wedlock. Now that's a bad thing in society at this time, a very bad thing, right? It brands you as the A, right? You have that big A on you. Her baby, who was less than 6 months old, was deemed feeble-minded. I challenge any of you to figure out if a baby at 6 months has anything more than maybe some hints of developmental, alteration. I don't even know how to put it, right? Feeble-minded, you're going to say this baby is feeble-minded? So her mom, her family members, her daughter, all feeble-minded. And they said, she was young, we can sterilize her and then we can let her free because she can't be a problem to society because she can never have more babies. So it saved us money too. This was the other approach to sterilization, is you could sterilize these young women or men, toss them back out into society. You didn't have to provide for them. All in the name of progressivism. On September 10th, 1924, the Colony Special Board of Doctors ruled in favor of Albert Priddy, who was the superintendent of the colony, his request to sterilize Carrie. So now the colony has said, yes, we want to sterilize her. Dr. Priddy petitioned the local county court to appoint Robert Shelton, a lawyer, as Carey's guardian. I'm giving you these names for a reason, and they granted it. Shelton was then authorized to bring challenge to this Virginia statute. So Pretty said they're going to sterilize him. He's in cahoots with Laughlin and Strode. He picks the lawyer to be the overseer of Carey as a guardian, and then says, now bring suit on her behalf. The legal wrangling continues. Shelton he wasn't her lawyer, he hired Irvin Washington to be legal counsel to represent Carey. Whitehead was a close friend of Audrey Strobe. He was also connected with the colony and the superintendent of the colony. He's representing Carey, but he's in cahoots with everyone else. Whitehead acted as Carey's lawyer from the first appearance to the Supreme Court. He was her representative, her legal representative the whole way. It ought to be obvious there's a lot of conflict between the players in this, right? So Strode is a central node with Laughlin kind of out on the side, but Strode has connections to the colony, Whitehead and Pretty, and they all have connections to each other. Carey's out here. Is Carey really being taken care of? So Whitehead served that group of conspirators quite well. He filed suit in the Amherst County Circuit Court to block the sterilization. This was the first step, the circuit court. After the circuit court ruled in favor of the colony, which means the law's holding up as they wanted it to, appealed to the Virginia Supreme Court, which had a different title at that time. The Supreme Court ruled, again, in favor of the colony and in favor of the law. Then he filed an appeal with the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1927, on the 2nd of May, the Supreme Court ruled 8-1 in favor of the colony. 8-1. That made said states could now force individuals to be sterilized against their will or against their wishes. It became law of the land. I'm going to tell you something really depressing. It is still law of the land. We don't sterilize people anymore, but it's law of the land. We could start it up at any time. Okay? It would end up back in the courts, but how many people would go through a process of demeaning life before the court ruled on it? In a major ruling, this individual, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who we hold up as a great institution of legal mind, and he was, said it's better for the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles, Mom, Carey, her daughter, are quite enough. I think this is one of, we have a judge in here, and we can talk about this, but I think it's one of the worst rulings the Supreme Court ever laid down. 8-1. So now compulsory state-sponsored sterilization is now law of the land. Carey was forcibly sterilized on October 19th, 1927. Her daughter, Vivian, died at the age of 8, in the care of Carey's former foster parents. I will say she was impregnated by a nephew of the foster parents. It was a rape. That didn't matter. None of that stuff mattered. Her daughter died without ever spending time really with her mother. 60 to 70,000 Americans were sterilized under these laws after Buck v. Bell. Even in the 2010s, California was coercing sterilization among female prisoners. Again, it is still law of the land. This is the sad legacy of Harry Laughlin. All right, in the last few minutes, how the Nazis leaned into American law. So this Australian scholar mentions that law effectively led us to Auschwitz. I won't read the rest of it, and I think she's correct. The Germans were nothing if they weren't litigious and good at crossing T's and dotting I's. Nearly 10 years before the Nazi Party racist ideology was influencing German law, Hitler was already writing about these ideas in Mein Kampf, okay? We saw a quote earlier from Mein Kampf. I won't read that one because I'm trying to get done here. The success of Laughlin's model eugenic sterilization law, as well as the broad application of American immigration, citizenship, and race laws, was encouraging to the legal-minded Nazis. They saw these things as, look at the leadership the United States is doing in this area. And Hitler and the Nazi legal scholars saw the United States as the world leader in the establishment and application of racial law. And I don't think they were wrong. So the Nazis modeled their race and eugenic laws on our laws. They sat down and looked at our laws and decided if it works there. They didn't take them wholesale, and there was not a lot of coercion, but it's pretty clear from a number of scholars that there's a lot of influence of the American law on Nazi law. So Nazi segregation laws, consider these like American race, Jim Crow laws. Numerous segregation laws that consign Jews and other non-Aryans to the fringes of society. So this is the first thing that happens. The major difference between Nazi segregation laws and Jim Crow laws was that the Nazis didn't even believe in separate but equal. Like it was just separate. You're not equal, you're separate. I'll skip that quote. There are eugenic sterilization laws. 1933 law of prevention for hereditary diseased offspring. They called it something nice, sounds appropriate for eugenic days. It was based on Laughlin's model and the California law again. 400,000 Germans were sterilized, so they were much more effective than the United States between 1933 and 1939. So a lot more in a shorter period of time. Nazi citizenship and anti-miscegenation laws. These are the Nuremberg laws, the famous Nuremberg laws. The first one was the Reich Citizenship Law in 1935. This aimed to limit citizenship only to Aryans. And of course, you have to figure out what Aryans are. So if you're trying to define Jewishness, the hardliners liked the American model, which was the one-drop rule, which meant if you had one drop of African American, right, and then in the parlance, Negro blood, you were not white. This is what the hardliner Nazis wanted. Turned out the moderates won because they thought that was too far. Crazy. The Reich Citizenship Law defined Jewishness by genetic pedigrees. We're using the same playbook, right? So a full Jew is someone who has 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents. A Michelin first degree is 2 Jewish grandparents, and a Michelin second degree is 1 Jewish grandparent. No citizenship to full Jews, and a second-class citizenship, at least initially. They were finally removed completely from the Michelin class. Didn't save any of them from the Holocaust, right? That status didn't matter. Your likelihood to end up in the gas chamber was equal whether you were a second-class Michelin or a full Jew. Turns out the state of Israel thought if this law was good enough for the Nazis, 1 Jewish grandparent is enough to make you Jewish and a citizen automatically of the state of Israel, which I think is an appropriate, middle finger to the Nazis, saying, you know what, we're not going to disagree with you and we're going to live through this. I think that's really nice. 1935 law of protection for German blood and honor. Now it's starting to sound blood and soil stuff. Aimed to regulate private interactions between Germans and Aryans and non-Aryans. These are the anti-miscegenation laws. Prohibited marriage and sexual relationship between Aryans and Jews, Gypsies, Negroes, and all of their bastards, right? Again, this scholar has said, law has effectively led us to Auschwitz. And I'm not going to cover the Holocaust. That's a whole other lecture, right? But I think she's not wrong. That without the laws, the legal precedents that the Nazis established to segregate their society, to remove people from society, to other people from society, they could not have ended up where they were. So, some concluding remarks. Most progressives were genuine in their belief that eugenics could be used for the betterment of mankind. I don't think they were bad human beings. They thought this was justice for all. It's their progressive era of prejudice that influenced the theory and practice and made it more injustice for some, right? The Nazi application of Nazi race and eugenic laws actually resulted ultimately in the Holocaust and Shoah. I use those two terms in my class because Hashoah is the Hebrew word referring to the death of 6 million plus Jews. There were other non-Jews, the Roma, Sinti, a lot of other suffering minority classes that were put to death by the Nazis, which are considered under the umbrella of the Holocaust writ large. Theirs was an injustice for a great many, right? So we went from idealism, justice for all, like we're going to make society better, to a really warped idea of making society better where you end up with injustice for many. And I think with that, I would say that our eugenic ideas are not quite dead. And I would ask you, what kind of justice is there in the future that's related to these kinds of ideas? And I welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Mannie. I see some questions over here. Just pass you the mic.
Well, it's not much of a question, but it's more of a statement, because I do think that learning about eugenics is very important, especially if you're going into some kind of history degree. And I'd also like to point out the fact that eugenics was not just used for Nazism, but it was also used for, and also Jim Crow laws, but it was also used for the death of like several Native American and indigenous people.
Absolutely.
And I just kept getting reminded of this, and I need to get this out of my head, but there's one book where it was like this anatomy book about how Native Americans are different to white people, and they used like an entirely different grain to print on the paper to show the indigenous people having softer skulls and weaker bones than the the settlers, to show how they were better and the Native Americans were not.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular book. There are several anatomy books. The classic, I will point out, this is a science thing. I'm a scientist. The classic anatomy book for learning anatomy for surgery is mostly it is very detailed and considered the Bible of anatomy books. It's based mainly on dissections of prisoners in concentration camps. But we use it. I don't think you can't, it's not gone. You can't just go away with it. It's like the atom bomb. It's not gone because we don't like it. But I think we need to be educating our current day medical students what they are using to learn, to give honor to the people who were demeaned and killed for those things. So yeah, the Native American population, I didn't even touch on that. We were taking Native Americans away from their families and putting them in white homes and institutions to educate them to become less Native, right? To put another Nazi connection in it, Hitler thought that our genocide of the Native Americans, that's what he based his movement through Eastern Europe. He based it on our settler movement across this country. So yeah, there are a lot of other targets for eugenics. I was trying to give you a shorter thing, but I would be more than happy to talk about that because there are a lot of those things that happen. We have one over in the back. You can speak it out and I'll re-say it. So the question is, I said eugenics is bad science, and does it have lingering impacts on science? The answer to that is yes, right? So I just gave you one with that anatomy book. That's one prominent example. I think it tainted science in an irreversible way. We're never going to come back from that piece of our collective scientist history. We own that. For right or wrong, we own that, right? And I think that's why I teach it, because I want students, and I think it's not just important for historians, I think it's important for scientists to understand this stuff, because they were the ones driving this stuff, right? And it impacted medicine. So getting medical students to understand these things is really important. So I think it's had long-lasting effects. I think it had some positive effects. There were scientists, not all scientists were eugenicists at the time, right? Not all biologists or geneticists believed in eugenics. There were philosophers, Franz Boas, for one example, who were fighting this tooth and nail. There were famous geneticists who were fighting this tooth and nail. So I think we changed as a community some of the ethical ways we approach things, right? Not enough. Many of the things we now do in medicine are direct consequences of the Nuremberg trials for the doctors, right? So the kind of medical ethics we have now comes out of the Holocaust. Ironically, before the Second World War, the Germans' medical community was considered the most ethical community in medicine. They started medical ethics. Now, we can look at it now and say, there was nothing ethical about what you did, but at the time, that was what it looked like. So yeah, there's a lot of lingering effects.
I just wanted to add a point about Buck versus Bell. My understanding is that several years later, after the decision, a reporter tracked them down and found that the 8-year-old, before she died, was an average student. Yeah. That there was no way that they could say that she had been feeble-minded, and that her mother, the mother's mother, the grandmother, was deemed feeble-minded because she had loose morals.
Right. Same reason for Carrie being in there.
And Carrie was raped. Yeah. And that was what her problem was, because then she had a child.
And there's evidence that Carrie was an above-average student in school. So there's absolutely no evidence that they had any mental incapacity at all, that they were completely functional. Now, a lot of times and to bring off this, like those IQ tests of the soldiers, are you deemed a moron because you only got through 3rd grade and you can't read and write? So you can't take the test effectively, right? There's a lot of these things. This is part of the reason why education now is doing away with standardized tests, because we know that these have impacts. Societally, it's not equal.
I just wanted to mention, I'm sure you're familiar with the 1940s case involving a man who committed 3 crimes. He'd been convicted twice before, and they had a law in Oklahoma that said that the state could sterilize you at that point. Yeah. And he took his case up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, which was all white male, said, this isn't fair, this isn't due process.
Yeah.
And they reversed that decision.
Right.
So there is contrary law about a right to reproduce in that case.
Right, right. You can speak it, and you're getting the mic. Thank you for the comments, by the way.
So, in the after World War II, in the Soviet Union and China, this is actually as eugenics like Lysenkoism, which would you consider that which is what, like these plant breeding practices that are now pseudoscientific, that led to famines in those countries. Would you consider that an example of like the failure of eugenics? And
so yeah, it's a great question. So Lyshenko was Stalin's eugenicist. There's a great book out. I can't remember the title of it. I'll try to get the title and give it to Jo, and she can pass it along. That's about Lyshenko and Stalin. Basically, Lyshenko was this really not very good geneticist who was raised to the top of the genetics crop by Stalin. And like you said, a lot of his things, he was trying to breed better wheat, and in fact, he wasn't good at it, and it resulted in famines. And we know that there were 20 to 30 million people that died during the 1930s, 40s, in and after the Second World War in the then Soviet Union. I don't think that was, it might have been eugenic in hindsight. I don't think it was planned as eugenic. I think Stalin actually saw Lyshenko as a comrade in the political sense. I think we see similar things in our society today. I think he saw him as a comrade in political sense, had no idea about the science, but he was a true blue Bolshevik, so therefore give him the power and he wasn't good at it, and it resulted in these things, which in the end were beneficial in some ways for Stalin's power consolidation. So I don't think it was eugenic necessarily, but in hindsight you could look at it and it had a similar effect. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, to provide some context to my question, there's actually been an ad, an American Eagle ad, that was deemed controversial because there was a motto or like a pun where they did a pun on jeans as in pants and genes as in DNA genes. And it was with Sydney Sweeney, and people found it controversial as people thought it like promoted like eugenic ideals and glorifying the blonde and blue eyes. So I just wanted to ask a question. So like in the public sector, especially like in entertainment, should companies and like other people consider like historical and cultural context that might make like ads like these or like anything else problematic?
That is a great question. I just gave a talk on campus in a social justice class on the history of anti-Semitism. And one of the context of that is because we're in this period right now where there is a lot of rightfully proper concern for the Palestinian people, but a lot of that protest crosses into anti-Semitic territory because of the words that we use. This is a perfect example. The words that we choose to use have meaning. Words have meaning. We can't just fling them out there like we see being done a lot without, there might be consequence to that. So yeah, I think that there should be ethics that drives this at the level of corporations, but we know that other things drive profit margins and things like that drive it, and ethics go out the window. But yeah, I personally think that we should have a little bit more control over what we say and how we say it, and more knowledge about what words mean. And maybe then we wouldn't be so hurtful to each other.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What do you think of people like basically anti-Arab racism being the norm in the U.S. and people giving away with that in the name of like fighting discrimination and stuff? You know, it's just like the norm to like treat, to kind of teach people the behavior of someone.
Yeah, I think that my personal belief is that all kinds of prejudice have some meaning to the person who holds those things. We're not born prejudiced, we learn these things, right? It's our community, it's our families, it's our leaders. We learn these things. I don't think there's justification for any kind of prejudice personally. If I could wave a magic wand and make us not do that, that would be my first choice, right, of all things. Because I think we would have world peace if we didn't have those things. But we as human beings group things. As I tell this to science students all the time, biology students all the time. Scientists group things. We put things in bins. That's what we do, right? And then we do statistics to see how similar or different things are. That's a human trait. We do that. We hang out with people that we like for certain reasons. They have certain traits that we like. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's when collectively larger communities start causing harm to other communities or policies start to cross into those regions, that's when it becomes inherently problematic, right? So having likes and dislikes is that's a human trait. We're never going to get rid of that, I think. That's not going to go away as much as we would like it to. That kumbaya is never happening. We can have those things as long as our influence and our feelings are not put out to hurt others, right? That's where the line has to be really paid attention to. That's probably not a good answer for the question, but it's the best one I have.
Are there any organizations that are currently working to hold the medical and science communities accountable for the past and what they've been, how they're teaching and addressing these disparities and how they treated the people that they used to get all this data?
Right, so is that the first question? Let me answer the first one first, okay? Unless there's a second part to that. If it's separate, I'll answer that one first. So the question is there any group, community, organization that's currently looking to influence medical education, medical practice as a reflective practice on what we have done in the past. Does that summarize it? Yes and no, okay, which is probably the answer you expected to get. I'm involved with a group that is looking at Holocaust education in particular as one component of that wheel. The Lancet Journal, which is the highest ranked medical journal, published an article in 2023, 24, somewhere in that range, maybe in 2022, that looked at Holocaust education and the influence of the Holocaust on medical practice and how we need to bridge that gap. So there are movements out there. Unfortunately, a lot of this still ends up being the biases that currently still exist within human beings that are running these communities, right? We haven't done away with the biases that gave rise to the biases in the progressive era. Just look around you, right? They still exist. And people who are in power still have those things. So fixing it isn't a priority for some people. So the short answer is yes and no. The short-term answer is not really. But I'm hoping, I'm hopeful. I'm working with at least this one group that's trying to make a difference, right? They've generated, it's through Hebrew University, and we've generated this large, massive online content course that has been used for 10,000 students or something like that worldwide, but we're trying to get it as part of the culture of medical schools so that medical students learn this is the history of where medicine is. This is how medical ethics arose because of these things that happen by supposedly ethical doctors, right? And when I'm teaching this in class, what I'm trying to convince students of is not just to see all those things in the past as bad, but to use it as a learning experience to reflect upon what you do and how you practice today so that you maybe don't make similar mistakes. We will make mistakes. Inevitably, we'll make mistakes. But if we're a little more reflective about the past, we can maybe prevent some of the future. So, second question.
What are, or you may not know, practical ways for people who do want to help rebuild that trust between the white community and historically rural communities, especially in the medical environment, especially now with vaccines, COVID, everything, there's so much distrust. How do you combat that and rebuild that trust within those communities?
So the question is, there's a lot of mistrust between majority white community and people of color, largely communities, Native American communities, many identities. It's not just color. There's mistrust. And in the African American community, there's a lot of history for that. In the Native American community, there's a lot of history for that. Tuskegee, you all know about Tuskegee, right? Henrietta Lacks, you all know about these things. These are long-standing traumas to the African American community. I'm going to beg off the question at some level because I'm not a physician and I'm not embedded in the medical community. But to answer the question, I think I can speak to tangentially because my partner's a physician at the University of Missouri and a faculty member in medicine at the University of Missouri. There's an effort, at least in family medicine, to have conversations about historical inequities in medicine with the students. So I think the change is going to come when physicians understand these things and become more sensitive to these things. Like there are so not to keep everyone, but there's a good example. There's a creatine measurement for kidney function that was done for a long time that made adjustments based on race. Because there was a belief that this level of creatine was naturally higher in African Americans. This was across the medical community. It's in the last few years been done away with because there's absolutely no evidence for that. The consequence of that is when your creatine goes high, that's a suggestion that your kidneys are not functioning properly. So when they get to a certain level, then you start looking at, do I need to think about dialysis in the future? Do I need to think about transplantation in the future? Well, if your levels are allowed to be higher because you're at a cutoff because of your race, that means only above that is it a problem. But in reality, down here it was a problem. By the time they reach your critical level, it's too late. So many African Americans really lost out on kidney care because of these things. So there are a lot of these things that are just ingrained in the system that are being worked out. I'm happy to say, there are people fighting the good fight. Not all of us are doing that. And I would encourage all the rest of you to fight the good fight. But as you're fighting the good fight, I will remind you, words, things you say, things you do have consequence. When you're fighting for one community, do not demean, demonize, and otherwise set aside another marginalized community to make this, it's not one versus the other. We all, as the ship, rise together, okay? I don't know if you have any time for any other questions or whether that was a good segue to the end, but there's a question back there.
We are actually out of time right now, so I love the conversation that we're having. And if you have other questions or lingering questions, I'm sure that Mannie would love to talk about that and answer that if you want to come up front. But I would love to thank Dr. Mannie Liscum. If we would all thank him together. Thank you.
Thank you for sticking it out.
Well, thank you, everyone. The symposium is over for the day, but please don't forget to come out tomorrow at 9 a.m. in Coulter Lecture Hall.